Hi there, BookTube. It's the beginning of June and high time for me to do a May wrap-up with my delights and discoveries and any disappointments of the month. I finished 19 books in May. Yes, 19. A lovely, rich reading month with 7 what you might call 5-star reads in there, which I will come to in the course of this wrap-up. I threw myself into a number of readathons this month, 7 of them too, I think, as it happens. Misery May, Mental Health May, Springathon, Spoonies Readathon, Asian Readathon. What have I forgotten? May of the Moderns, and one more. What was the other one? Oh, Horror Mayhem. That's it. So, yeah, 7. Of the 19 books I finished, 9 I've talked about in other videos that are either already up or will come soon. So I'll try and feature more on the 10 things that I haven't talked about in more detail elsewhere. But, you know, a wonderful month, and I really want to thank the hosts of those 7 readathons that I took part in. But because I did so many, I'm not going to kind of talk about the hosts as I go through. But the thanks is genuine, because it really, gives a lovely range and interest to my reading, and prompts me to read things I've meant to for ages, or things that I wouldn't otherwise have thought of. So thank you. First thing I'm going to mention is the one poetry collection that I finished this month, and that's by Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner, and she is a writer from the Marshall Islands. So you may guess that was something that I read as a part of my reading scallydandle, of reading around the world, authors from all different countries of the world, because, why else would you seek out a book from the Marshall Islands? And I've got a video about that, which I will kind of put up later in the week. But what I want to say here is, I would really love more people to read this poetry collection. It is absolutely not just a book for those of you who are, on a reading around the world sort of jag like me. So watch out for that video and consider reading this book. The other kind of scallydandle book that I read this month was Maiba, a novel from Papua New Guinea by Russell Maiba, and I have to say that is one that is really, I would only recommend if you're doing some sort of read around the world adventure challenge, whatever, like me. It's got some wonderful description of the way of life and how it's changing in Papua New Guinea, and so lots of interest. But the writing is not brilliant, and it's quite a chaotic book in style, and not in a good way. So I'm also gradually, I suppose, reading books from various sort of not quite countries, if you know what I mean. So as well as the 195 that I'm absolutely trying to sort of gradually tick off, I'm also interested in reading things from sort of autonomous regions and, semi-independent places and places with distinct identity. So, and I believe that this, Boulder, is the first book I've read by a Catalan author writing in Catalan. It was translated by Julia Sanches. It's a wonderful, short, intense novel, really strong writing, very psychologically and emotionally astute, I thought. But I've talked about it in another video along with this one, so I won't go into detail about either of them. This one is Hankan by it's Greek Lessons. It's her new novel. It's translated from the Korean by Deborah Smith and Emily Ye-Won, and in contrast to Boulder, it's on the surface a quieter book, but with sort of huge turbulence under that surface, I would say. Even better than The Vegetarian, in my opinion, if you've read that by Hankan. That's her sort of best known book up to now, I think. I I prioritised getting to that one this month because of the Asian Readathon, but it also turned out to be a really good choice for the Spoonies Readathon, which is about invisible disability in featuring in literature, fiction and non-fiction, because one of the two protagonists in this book has what I would describe as sensory processing issues that mean that she ends up like being a selective mute for big chunks of her life, because of the way kind of sound and so on impinges on her. And the other protagonist has macular degeneration, which is a kind of progressive form of vision loss. So, as I say, great Spoonies book. Both these books also worked really well for Misery May, but so does an awful lot of the books that I read, I think. And they're neither of them depressing books, because they're really looking, I suppose, at the human condition and human relationships. I could say the same, both misery Mayish, but also not ultimately depressing, for another novel I read in translation this month, which was A Heart So Wide by Javier Marias, translated by Margaret Jewel Costa. Such a good translator. I've read quite a few things translated by her. This was a buddy read by Mark Nash with Mark Nash. And this book by Marias, I would say, had some of the best writing in it that I read all month. But it wound up, whereas these two, both 5-star books, Her Heart So White wound up being a 4-star book for me, because somehow it had such a brilliant start, and so much to love in it, and yet somehow the payoff at the end didn't match the promise of the beginning. So that kind of little element of disappointment kind of knocked it down for me. The other book was still a 4-star book. Another book that I read this month, which was the one I read for my real life book group, and that was Travels in the Scriptorium, Travels to the Scriptorium. Let me look down which around. Travels in the Scriptorium by Paul Auster, was another one where the sort of initial promise of the book kind of fell away for me at the end. So although I was quite engaged with it, I ended up only sort of rating it as a 3-star book, because I think it had to take the prize for the most disappointing ending of any book I read this month. If you've read it and you'd like to differ, feel free in the comments. I would love to hear an alternative viewpoint on that. The other translated book that I read this month was a non-fiction choice, which I picked for Mental Health May, the Mental Health May Readathon, and that was Man's Search for Meaning by Austrian psychiatrist and psychologist and psychotherapist Viktor Frankl. I can't tell you who this was translated by, because this edition doesn't mention the translator. It's a book that I've meant to read for years, and it is, the first part of this book is absolutely fascinating and moving, and let me explain. Frankl lived through the experience of being in 4 different concentration camps during World War II. Now, he's Jewish, and the first part of this book is writing about that experience. The rest of the book is about his form of psychotherapy that he developed called logotherapy, and that is not of such general interest, I would say, but his testimony, I suppose, from his time in concentration camps, is extremely powerful, and I suppose he approaches it with a kind of a calm, analytical voice that makes the horror readable, but yet really kind of helps you think through its sort of psychological implications, I suppose. I had a slight reservation, okay, and which I will share. And again, feel free to disagree in the comments if you've read this book. But my reservation was that it felt like, almost as a psychiatrist and psychologist and psychotherapist, he's kind of implying that your sort of mental strength or some sort of, I don't know, having a positive attitude and things to live for was a significant factor in whether you survived the concentration camp experience. And for me, I suppose, I almost question whether that's sort of, actually I don't know. I don't know how to express this. It's like, if you were struck with disease, violence, or just straightforward starvation, would your positive attitude really make you survive? There has to be some other sort of circumstances or elements of sort of luck or fortune that mean that you got through. I don't know, so mixed feelings. What is undoubtedly true is this was an extremely influential book, through the second half of the 20th century, and had a key role in kind of contributing to a more kind of humanist approach to psychotherapy. So, yeah, a book I'm really glad I've read. Now, two other non-fiction books I read this month related to sort of Springathon and the Book Naturalist Book Club. And one of those was Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Again, this was a buddy read. I read it with Jolene, the Bookworm Adventure Girl. And like this one, it is one of the most influential books of the sort of middle of the 20th century. Why? Well, Carson was a marine biologist, but also a writer, and Silent Spring is I don't know, it attributed almost to being one of the sort of founding sort of forces in modern environmentalism. Why? Basically, Carson recognised the disastrous impact of synthetic pesticides at a time when they were being promoted as the sort of save all for agriculture and aggressively marketed by big agrochemical companies and promoted by government bodies and all of that. And she saw the accumulating scientific evidence of the damage they were doing to the natural world, because things don't exist in isolation. You can't kind of kill off all the insects you don't want without damaging the ones that you do want, and then damaging the birds that eat the insects or the fish that those insecticides live in the rivers that those insecticides sort of seep into. All of that. She got that. And in Silent Spring, she kind of captures the evidence with the kind of rigour of her training as a scientist, but then writes about it with, in the most poetic prose of a skilled writer. And that's the strength of the book. A kind of typical chapter in the book, she'll sort of start with some, quite, poetic imagery about the natural world, and then she'll move into a kind of quite horrific description of a specific, well-attested incident of damage or disaster, and then generalise from that to the wider implications and the scientific kind of explanation and so on. Now that sounds like it could be a bit repetitive, but it isn't actually. The chapters have a kind of a cumulative impact that is extraordinary. Definitely a 5-star read for me. Very controversial at the time, but then extremely influential. The other Springathon read I had was the book naturalists, one by the book naturalists sort of proposed author of the month, Sonia Shah. Now, she is a science journalist. She writes about science and nature, but also how they intersect with politics, I guess, in a way, I suppose, similar to Carson, but contemporary. So the book I chose was The Next Great Migration, The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move, which came out in 2020. Now, like Carson, she's kind of on a bit of a mission, I suppose, in this book, because she sets out to show how bad science and bad history have been used to sort of generate fear and misunderstanding about migration, whether that's by plants or animals or people. And politically, I'm totally with her on that. As a book, it kind of wound up being a 3-star read for me. Why? I think because she just tried to pack too much in and make everything fit with her argument. And so at times, I got a bit frustrated with it, although there's some brilliant bits, really, interesting. Whew. Now, Heidi and Doris, I think, picked Sonia Shah as their chosen writer for the month for the Book Naturalists book club because she's American Asian, and so it was to fit with the Asian Readathon. And it just happens that my last nonfiction choice of the month was also one for the Asian Readathon, and that was a 2018 book, We Are Displaced, also about migration, by Malala Yousafzai and Liz Welch. Now, much simpler book than The Next Great Migration, but it was a 4-star read for me because it's a straightforward book that achieves what it sets out to do really well, I thought, because what it is it's basically a collection of personal stories by girls and young women who've been in some way displaced, been refugees or migrants of one kind or another. And, it's just spot on, really brings us a real life experience and emotion to a topic that's sort of batted around politically in ways that don't recognise perhaps the reality of individual experience within it. Whew. So, a good one. I actually read 2 other Asian authors this month without particularly thinking of them perhaps in connection with the Asian Readathon. One was Pod the author is Laline Paull, and she's British but with Indian parents, migrants. There you go. And Pod is her new novel, and it was one of the surprise successes of the month for me. I read it early in the month, and I did a video about it with a book that I read at the end of April. And why was it a surprise success? Because it's written from the viewpoint of sea creatures. The main character is like a dolphin. There's other cetaceans, and I have a bit of a aversion to books from the viewpoint of animals. They often don't work for me. And it's also a book with a bit of a message, and again, that doesn't always work for me if I feel like I'm being told what to think, even if I agree with the message. But somehow she pulled it off, and well enough for it to be a 4-star book for me. The other author was Vaishnavi Patel, who's a American writer with Indian parents, migrants again. That was Kaikeyi, which was, and also suffered a little bit from slightly too obvious message at times, but again, definitely a 4-star read, and was one of the books that I read for the BookTube Prize this month. And I've done a video about all 6 of the books in my BookTube Prize group, and so I won't say much about any of them, but what I will say is that one of them was the worst book that I read this month, and that, just to give you fair warning in case you're tempted to read it, well, other people liked it, but I didn't. That was The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and yeah, if you want to hear why I hated it, go and watch the other video. Then there were 3 kind of solidly decent books that I did enjoy, one of which was Kaikeyi, one of which was Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabriel Zevin, but I actually read that before this month, so I won't talk about that. And one was Stories from the Tenants Downstairs by Siddiq Fafana, which was a book of interconnected short stories set in a Harlem high-rise block, and with a really strong voice, but interconnected short stories, not really my thing, I guess. And then 2 different, but for me, wonderful novels. My top 2, ranked books in that group, but also 2 of my top books of the month. And they were Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield and Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. Yeah, 5-star highlights, very different. One quite realist, one quite surrealist. But if you want to find out more, you could watch my video, or you could watch the BookTube ranking video by Angelia, whose channel is Read and Reread, and she and I had very similar reactions to the 6 books in our group that we were both judges of. And yeah, go and check out her channel, because she only has like 600 or so subscribers, and she really could very well have more, I'd say. So both Our Wives and Trespasses had quite intensely moving latter stages to the story, and I've had a little tear in my eye with both of them, so they would definitely qualify as misery made books, but so does a lot of the stuff I read, I guess. I did make sure, though, for Misery Made, that I also read a Thomas Hardy short story, because Thomas Hardy was like the inspiration for the readathon, and it would have been a shame sort of not to. He's a favourite author of mine. It would have been a shame not to sort of visit his oeuvre while I was about it, even though I didn't have time to read a whole Hardy novel. I will read one later in the year for sure. I'm planning on reading The Woodlanders during October, I think. The other readathon that I read a short story for was Horror Mayhem. Now, actually, Our Wives is also a kind of horror book of a sort, but yeah, I wanted to nail it with a short story, and it was a good excuse to finally read one of M.R. James's ghost stories, which, Victorian ghost story writer, people are constantly kind of enthusing about M.R. James's ghost stories. Now, I was reminded, reading both the Hardy short story and this one, that short stories are not my favoured format for fiction. For all sorts of reasons that I won't go into here. But the other thing that really struck me with the M.R. James short story, and I picked one of his absolutely best known ones, Oh Whistle and I'll Come, or something along those lines. I'll put it in the show notes. But I don't think ghost stories really do it for me. I don't seem to react to them the way you're meant to, and I don't know why that is. And yeah, it's probably just me. there you go. So I have saved 3 absolutely brilliant books for the end of this video, and they were 3 that I read for May of the Moderns, although one of them was also my most deliberate Spoonies Readathon choice. So I'm going to start with that one, and that was Flush by Virginia Woolf. Now, Flush is Woolf's kind of fictionalized biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's spaniel, who's called Flush. And I think she wrote it as a way of writing about Barrett Browning. Now, you probably already know, but Elizabeth Barrett Browning was one of had a sparkling reputation as a poet in her lifetime and in the period, soon afterwards. So she was a Victorian woman poet. But by the time Woolf wrote Flush in the 1930s, Barrett Browning had really kind of fallen out of favour, I guess, but not with Woolf, who's a real admirer of hers. And I think she maybe had a kind of sense of connection with her, partly because they're both women writers who had to deal with health issues and stop them thwarting their intellectual and creative ambitions, I suppose. And that really comes through in this book, and that was why it was a Spoonies, invisible disability choice for me, and a good one. Not my favourite Woolf. It's that animal protagonist viewpoint thing again. So, only a 4-star book, but although, Woolf can't write a bad sentence as far as I'm concerned. So, I'm really, really glad to have read it. The last 2 books I'm going to talk about, May of the Moderns choices, were both absolute 5-star books, though. And they are both by authors who, like Woolf, have, just write the most perfect English prose. Beautiful sentences, beautiful language, elegant and precise, and yeah. So, who are they? E.M. Forster and Jean Rhys. Now, and here are the books. This one, A Room with a View by E.M. Forster, was a reread for me. I'm rereading all of Forster's novels in chronological order or publication order with Jen the Librarian and various others this year, and I was so happy that I did make the effort to reread this. It was Forster's 3rd book, published in 1908. I read somewhere, I'm not sure where, you may know, that Forster does irony but not satire, and I think that really nails it in describing his writing, because there is lots of humour in this book, lots of funny moments, but it's not, and it kind of pokes fun at people, but it's not cruel in the way it does it. He's a very humane writer, I suppose, and he has a kind of philosophical underpinning to his writing that's about being true to yourself and rejecting hypocrisy and finding meaning in life and meaning in love. And of course, with hindsight, I suppose we might see that as being not unconnected with his experience as a gay man born in 1879. So, never being able to be open about his sexuality other than with his closest friends, really. And, I suppose that makes it kind of like a Pride Month pre-read for me. Forster, like Woolf, was one of the Bloomsbury group of writers who I suppose you might describe as kind of upper middle class, intelligentsia, a bit of an elite. Okay. Jean Rhys is a different kettle of fish. And this book, kind of unlike this one, this one sits in a sort of very much an upper middle class world. This one hits a kind of a seamier part of society, although, like Forster, she really skewers kind of British manners and society of the early part of the 20th century. And I think in writing this book, she really drew on her own experiences, because the main protagonist in this book is Anna, and Anna had quite a comfortable upbringing on an island in what was then sort of the British West Indies. But she finds herself, as Reese did, transported, displaced, a migrant again, to England in her teens, late teens, and having to scrape a living as a kind of third-rate actress or chorus girl, and then she sort of slips from that into being like a kept woman, and then kind of almost into a sort of a downward spiral. So the world we get in here is a London of sort of tatty lodgings and trying to hang on to, at least one smart dress so you can kind of go out and look like you're I don't know, have a superficial glamour, even though everything is, you're having to madly mend it, and hope people don't notice. Theatres, pubs, a sort of demi-monde, I suppose. Brilliant, wonderful, absolutely loved this book. I really did. One of the joys of it as a book is that Anna's experiences in London are kind of counterbalanced with her memory of her childhood in the Caribbean, and her, as a child, she wanted to be black. She felt more comfortable with and identified perhaps with that, more than the sort of racist British colonialist sort of attitudes of her stepmother and so on. So there's a kind of a duality in the book that is fascinating, and which I think Reese herself experienced. This was published in 1934. It's one of those books where, as you're reading it, every now and then you have to stop and just think, that sentence is perfect, and I just need to read it again or read it out loud to somebody else. I'm not going to read it out loud to you, but this is perhaps my top recommendation to you of the month, because, would you have heard of it otherwise? If you've read it, share your enthusiasm with me, I hope. And, what was your top recommendation from your reading in May? I always love to hear about that. I can add things to my future TBR as a result.